When the clock struck 12, the old Zenith TV in Marcus's attic buzzed to life. He hadn't touched the thing in years. It didn't even have a working power cord anymore. Yet there it was, the screen flickering with static, faint whispers threading through the hum of dead air. Marcus hesitated, his heart thudding in his chest. He had come up to the attic to sort through his late father's belongings, not to be haunted by ancient technology. But as he reached to unplug the TV, a precaution for his already jittery nerves, the static shifted. A pale, hollow-eyed face emerged on the screen. "Are you watching, Marcus?" The voice crackled like a distant storm. Marcus stumbled back, his hands trembling. The face leaned closer, though the screen stayed static-filled. "Turn to channel 13, it rasped. He froze. Channel 13 hadn't existed since the analog switch-off years ago. He fumbled for the old rotary dial, unable to resist the pull of the eerie directive. Click, click, click. The static gave way to something worse, a black and white broadcast of an empty TV studio, its stage lights flickering ominously. In the corner of the screen, the clock read 12:01 a.m. "Welcome to the final show," the voice crooned. "We've been waiting for you." Marcus had never been one for nostalgia. The attic, crammed with relics of his father's life, felt more like a burden than a treasure trove. His father, George Bellamy, had been an eccentric man with an obsession for old technology, particularly televisions. Growing up, Marcus remembered his father tinkering with bulky CRTs, mumbling about the golden age of broadcasting. Marcus had dismissed it as a harmless quirk until now. The Zenith TV was one of George's prized possessions, a relic from his days as a technician at the now defunct Channel 13 station. Marcus had heard the stories countless times, the late-night broadcasts, the off-air pranks, and the strange interference that plagued the station in its final days. When Channel 13 shut down in 1987, George had taken the Zenith home, claiming it held memories. As Marcus sat staring at the dim, flickering screen, he felt those memories reaching out to him. The broadcast showed an empty studio, but something about it was wrong. The shadows on the set didn't align with the studio lights, and the camera angles shifted as if an unseen operator was moving them. Marcus's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his daze. It was Emma, his ex-wife. He let it go to voicemail. They hadn't spoken in months, and now wasn't the time for a conversation about custody schedules or her new boyfriend. The voice from the screen spoke again, low and almost intimate. "Marcus Bellamy, you were always meant to tune in. Your father made sure of it." His chest tightened. The voice wasn't just eerie, it was familiar. Marcus glanced at the faded Channel 13 memorabilia scattered around the attic. His father's old uniform, a collection of reel tapes, and a bundle of notebooks with yellow pages. Flipping through one, he found frantic handwriting. "They're still here. The broadcast never stops. They're waiting for the right frequency and a right audience." A shiver ran down Marcus's spine. His father had always been a skeptic, not the type to believe in ghosts or conspiracies. Yet here were his paranoid ramblings, written with the conviction of a man desperate to warn someone, anyone. The screen crackled again, and Marcus's eyes snapped back to it. The broadcast now showed the studio filled with shadowy figures. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their forms dissolving into static and reforming as they approached the camera. "Do you see them?" the voice asked. Marcus felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He could see them, and he knew them. At the front of the crowd was his father, George Bellamy, his hollow eyes fixed on the camera. Marcus's hands trembled as he reached for the TV, his fingers brushing against the cold frame. The spectral image of his father on the screen remained fixed, staring as if through the camera and directly into Marcus's soul. He knew he should turn it off, unplug it, and leave the attic, but something kept him rooted in place, a pull he couldn't explain, a need to understand. On the screen, the figures behind his father flickered like dying flames, their forms constantly shifting between static and shadow. They didn't have faces, just vague outlines of bodies, yet their presence was suffocating. George stepped closer to the camera, his mouth moving, but the words came out in jagged bursts of static. "Marcus, you must stay away." Stay away? From what? The attic? The TV? Channel 13? The screen buzzed violently, and the image distorted, cutting to a different scene, a grainy black and white montage of the old Channel 13 studio in its heyday. A crew worked behind the cameras, setting up a live broadcast. The picture zoomed in on a young George Bellamy, smiling as he adjusted a microphone. Then, the scene shifted again. This time the studio was darker, the lights flickering as a pale figure in a tattered suit stood in the center of the stage. His face was obscured, his posture rigid, as if held up by invisible strings. The broadcast was muted, but Marcus could almost hear the crackling energy emanating from the screen. His father's voice returned, faint and layered with static. "They came for us. When the signal reached them, we thought we were broadcasting to nowhere, but something was listening." Marcus staggered back, clutching his chest. His father had never spoken about the final days of Channel 13, but he'd always sensed there was something his dad was hiding, something too unsettling to share. Now, it was clear why. A sharp knock at the attic door jolted Marcus. He whipped around, his heart pounding. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he descended the ladder and peered down the hallway. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time, but not from the attic door, from the front door downstairs. Marcus hesitated before moving toward it, his every step accompanied by the sound of static that now seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. He reached the door and swung it open. No one was there. Only the faint hum of static greeted him, riding the cold night breeze. Marcus shut the door, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Returning to the attic, he found the Zenith TV glowing brighter than before. The broadcast had changed again, now showing what looked like a live feed of his own living room. Marcus froze. The camera angle was high, almost like a security camera, and it was trained on him standing in the middle of the room. The voice returned, deep and distorted. "Welcome back, Marcus. It's time for your debut." The camera panned slightly, revealing the shadowy figures from earlier standing just outside his window. Their blank faces stared in, their heads tilting unnaturally. Marcus turned toward the window, but the glass was empty, no one was there. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his paralysis. It was Emma again. Desperate for some sense of normalcy, he answered. "Emma, listen, But her voice cut him off, frantic and sharp. "Marcus, are you okay? I've been watching the news. They're talking about Channel 13, something about strange broadcasts and..." The line went dead, replaced by the same static that filled the attic. The TV screen flickered again, and Marcus's father reappeared. This time, his face was clearer, the anguish etched into his features, unmistakable. "They're coming for you, son," George rasped. "They need someone to continue the broadcast. Don't let them take you, don't." A deafening screech tore through the attic, and the screen went black. For the first time, Marcus noticed the room felt colder, as if the temperature had plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the static had become a physical vibration in the air. Suddenly, the shadows in the corners of the attic deepened, coalescing into forms that began to take shape. They weren't just on the screen anymore, they were in the room with him. "Marcus," the voice whispered, no longer confined to the TV. It was everywhere, surrounding him. The broadcast must go on. Marcus's mind raced. He grabbed his father's notebooks, flipping through the pages desperately. Amid the scribbles, one phrase stood out, circled over and over. "The only way to end the signal is to destroy the source." He looked at the Zenith TV. It had to be the source. It was the only connection to whatever haunted Channel 13. Without thinking, he grabbed a hammer from a nearby toolbox and raised it above his head. The figures in the room hissed, their static forms darting toward him. Marcus swung the hammer down with all his strength, shattering the screen in a burst of sparks and glass. The attic went silent. For a moment, Marcus thought he had won, until the faint glow of the TV reignited, stronger than before. "Destroying the screen doesn't end the signal," the voice crooned, almost amused. "You've already tuned in, Marcus. There's no turning it off now." Marcus stood frozen as the Zenith TV reignited, its screen glowing brighter than ever. The jagged cracks spidering across the glass didn't seem to matter. The image was as vivid as before, pulsing with an almost lifelike quality. The attic was no longer just a room filled with memories. It felt alive, pulsating with an energy that Marcus couldn't contain or control. The shadows around him solidified, forming figures that now had faces Marcus recognized. His father, George Bellamy, stood among them, his expression a mix of sorrow and resolve. Behind him were others, former Channel 13 employees whose photos Marcus had seen in the old station archives. "They don't stop," George said, his voice carrying a weight of finality. "The signal isn't in the TV, Marcus, it's in you now." "In me?" Marcus's voice cracked. "What do you mean?" George stepped forward, his translucent form shimmering like static. "The signal has always needed a host, someone to keep the broadcast alive. I kept it dormant for years, hoping it would fade after Channel 13 shut down. But when I died, it latched onto the next connection. It latched onto you." Marcus staggered back, shaking his head. No, I didn't ask for this." "It doesn't matter what you asked for," George said, his voice rising. "The broadcast needs an anchor. It's how they feed. If you don't take control, they'll take you." The other shadowy figures began to move closer, their faces flickering between human and something unrecognizable. The air grew heavier, thick with a pressure that made Marcus's ears pop. "How do I stop it?" Marcus yelled, his voice desperate. George hesitated, his form flickering. "There's only one way," he said quietly. "You have to take over the broadcast, but you can't let it spread. You have to keep it contained." "Contain? How am I supposed to do that?" The screen of the Zenith TV suddenly shifted, displaying Marcus's reflection. But it wasn't just him, it was him sitting in a dimly lit studio, a microphone in front of him and cameras pointed in his direction. Behind him loomed the same shadowy figures, watching silently. "Welcome to Channel 13, the voice whispered from the TV. "It's time for your first broadcast." "No," Marcus shouted, turning to his father. "There has to be another way." George's face was etched with guilt. "If you refuse, the signal will spread. It'll infect every frequency, every device. Millions of people will see it, and they won't survive it." The attic began to warp, the walls bending and twisting as if the room were being consumed by the signal itself. Marcus could feel it pulling at him, tugging at his very essence. "I can't," Marcus whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know how to stop this." George placed a translucent hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, son, but you have to make the choice now." The Zenith TV flared, and suddenly Marcus was no longer in the attic. He was sitting in the same studio he had seen on the screen, the shadowy figures surrounding him. A microphone was in front of him, and a glowing red on-air sign blinked in the corner of his vision. The figures leaned in closer, their presence suffocating. Marcus reached for the microphone with trembling hands. His voice cracked as he spoke, his words echoing through the void. "This is Marcus Bellamy," he said. "You're tuned into Channel 13, the broadcast that never ends." The shadowy figures hissed, their static forms writhing as if in approval. The studio lights flickered, and Marcus felt a surge of energy course through him. He was no longer just Marcus, he was the anchor, the conduit through which the signal flowed. But in the back of his mind, one thought remained. If he could find a way to control the broadcast, to keep it from spreading, maybe he could end it once and for all. As the camera's red light blinked on, Marcus stared into the lens, his face calm but resolute. The shadowy figures watched, waiting. "Let's begin," he said, his voice steady. For weeks, Marcus broadcast from the dim, otherworldly studio. He followed an unspoken script, his words flowing as if they had always been etched into his mind. He told stories, chilling, cryptic tales that felt less like fiction and more like forgotten truths unearthed from some hidden corner of existence. The shadowy figures never left his side, their silent presence a constant reminder of the stakes. But he was learning. Each broadcast taught him something new about the signal and its rules. He discovered he could control the flow of the broadcast, choosing when to let it fade to static and when to bring it back to clarity. He carefully kept it contained, ensuring it never reached beyond the studio. The broadcast never aired live to the outside world, it remained locked in its pocket of reality, a self-contained loop. Marcus realized this was his father's legacy, a constant battle to keep the signal from spreading and to protect the world from its insidious influence. The shadowy figures seemed to approve, their forms flickering less violently as Marcus took control. He even began to see faint traces of humanity in their faces, as though they were regaining some small part of what they had lost. Occasionally, George's ghostly visage appeared, watching from the periphery. He never spoke again, but his expression was softer, less burdened. Marcus took it as a sign that he was doing what needed to be done. In the rare quiet moments, Marcus thought of Emma and his son. He longed to see them, to explain what had happened, but he knew he couldn't leave the studio. The signal was a prison, but it was one he had chosen to inhabit to protect them. Late one night, or what passed for night in the endless haze of the studio, the static on the monitors shifted. A single line of text scrolled across the screen. "The broadcast must end. Only you can decide how." Marcus stared at the message, his mind racing. Was this a trick? A test? Or was it a way out? He knew the risk of ending the broadcast. If it failed to sever the signal completely, the consequences would be catastrophic. But as he looked at the shadowy figures around him, their once frightening forms now strangely familiar, he felt a surge of determination. "I won't let it spread," he whispered. "I'll end it, no matter what it takes." He reached for the controls, his hands steady. The shadowy figures didn't stop him, they simply watched. Marcus took a deep breath and flipped the main switch, plunging the studio into darkness. For the first time in weeks, the static stopped. Marcus opened his eyes to find himself back in the attic, the Zenith TV dark and silent. The static was gone, the oppressive chill lifted, and the shadows had vanished. The notebook lay open on the floor, the last words his father had written now glowing faintly on the page. The signal ends when the anchor lets go. He sat there for a long moment, the weight of what he had done sinking in. He had severed the broadcast, but at what cost? The world was safe, for now, but the signal, like an ember, could always reignite. As Marcus descended the attic ladder, he glanced back one last time at the silent TV, a quiet resolve in his heart. Some frequencies are never meant to be heard.